Hey, this is Mike Steinell. Thanks for tuning in to Murder at Birdland, the audio novel. Hope you're enjoying it. Today's episode 10, has a special bonus piece of music at the end of it. It's called Lady Day Sits In. As you might suspect, it goes along with the story. The musicians on the recording are Rosanna Eckert on vocals, Pat Coyle on piano, Christopher Clark on bass, Chris McGuire on tenor saxophone, Steve Barnes on drums, and Gary Eckert on percussion. Yours truly, Mike Steinell on trumpet. We hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Rosewood Audio presents Murder at Birdland, an audio novel by Mike Steinell, narrated by Mike Steinell and special guest narrator Rich DeRosa. Murder at Birdland is a work of fiction, loosely inspired by the lives and experiences of jazz musicians in the late 1940s who performed in and around 52nd Street in New York City. All names, places, and incidents depicted in this novel are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events is purely coincidental. And now, Episode 10.
Chapter 19, Basie. Martin stood in the crowd outside the famous store. He checked the watch on his right arm, 2:10 a.m. loop time. The street was still buzzing. New York was indeed the town that never sleeps, and Martin, normally in bed by 10:30, was beginning to understand why. He glanced at the watch on his left wrist, 9:45 body time. Still early. He decided to stay until midnight. He could catch 2 sets, and if lucky, maybe hear Billie Holiday. Even if she didn't show, it would still be a thrill to see the Count. The Count Basie Orchestra rose to fame in the late 1930s after being discovered by record producer John Hammond. Hammond was a legend in the music business. Born into wealth, his mother being a Vanderbilt, he dropped out of Yale in 1930 and took up residence in Greenwich Village. Attracted to jazz music and sensitive to the discrimination of African Americans, he began to champion their music by featuring it on a local radio station. Eventually, he began working for Columbia and is generally credited with persuading Benny Goodman to hire black musicians, namely Charlie Christian, Teddy Wilson, and Lionel Hampton. In 1933, he discovered Billie Holiday and arranged for her recording debut. Legend has it that Hammond, while at a Benny Goodman gig in Chicago, went to his car on a break and heard a live broadcast from the Reno Club in Kansas City of the Count Basie Orchestra. He was so taken by the music that he drove all night to Kansas City and signed the band to a recording contract the next day. John Hammond had an ear for talent and a heart for the musicians that made it, regardless of color. In 1938, he organized one of the first jazz events at Carnegie Hall, from spirituals to swing. After serving in the military during World War II, he continued to discover and advocate for artists whenever he spotted quality. Working well into the 70s, his later discoveries included Pete Seeger, Aretha Franklin, Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, and Bruce Springsteen. Never in the history of jazz or pop has there been a more successful impresario. Hammond made Count Basie a star. The early records sold extremely well. They had a string of hits and developed a loyal following. The combination of great soloists like Earl Warren, Lester Young, Buck Clayton, and Herschel Evans, and an all-star rhythm section, Basie on piano, Walter Page on bass, Joe Jones on drums, and Freddie Green on guitar, was a potent recipe for success. The band was riding high in the polls at the beginning of the 1940s, but most of Basie's stars had gone on their own or had been drafted. On top of that, the American Federation of Musicians placed a ban on recordings, so record sales dropped off. In 1948, Basie downsized and began touring with an octet. This was the group that had just opened at the famous store. The famous store had no doorman, just a wooden sign, appearing nightly, the Count Basie Orchestra. As he approached, he overheard two men. "Billie's in town. They said she might sit in." Evidently the rumor was spreading. A crowd pressed toward the entrance. Inside, a man took money.
Cover charge is $1. Standing room's $0.25.
Martin paid and worked his way to an open table. He spotted Shooter and Sondra standing in the back. A minute later he had paid their cover, and they joined him. He held out his hand. "Hi, I'm Martin Spencer. I saw you at the club earlier." "I saw you too, Martin. I'm Sondra. Nice to meet you." Martin watched her as she took off her coat. She still wore her uniform from the club, a deep red halter-top bustier over a white silk blouse. The top buttons opened just enough to reveal a hint of cleavage. To Martin, the outfit seemed sexually exploitive, something a modern-day woman might protest. But it was undeniably alluring and surely good for tips. He realized he stared a bit too long and hoped she hadn't noticed. "Can I, buy you two a drink?" he asked. Shooter nodded, and Sondra said, "Sure, I'd love a drink." "So, what would you—"
I'll have a beer, Martin. Schlitz.
"Yeah, that sounds good. Same for me." She smiled. "Oh, okay, great. Coming right up." Martin backed away, still staring at Sondra, and bumped into a patron carrying drinks. I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry." Sondra had been watching. "You know, Martin, it might be better to actually look in the direction that you're going next time." He smiled and said, "Yeah, that's a good plan. That's a good plan." When he returned with the drinks, Sondra asked, "So, Martin, how do you know Shooter?" Martin was starting to explain when Shooter jumped in.
We're old friends. I knock 'em down, then peel 'em off the sidewalk on a regular basis.
He laughed, then corrected himself.
Nah, we just met tonight. Martin's from Kentucky. He's some fancy clinic kind of guy. Ain't that right, Martin?
It's Kansas, and I'm a clinical psychologist." Shooter shrugged.
I was close. Kentucky, Kansas, what the heck?
He leaned into the center of the table and looked at Sondra.
Martin's down here on some sort of mission, looking for somebody.
He squinted at Martin, then Sondra.
I think he might be a detective or a secret agent. This story about him being a shrink is probably just a cover.
He winked. Martin shifted in his chair. Sondra, sensing his embarrassment, jumped in. "Clinical psychologist? Wow, impressive. So you're a doctor, huh?" Martin smiled and shrugged his shoulders. He studied her. Everything about Sondra seemed familiar. Her eyes, her nose, her smile, her hair, the tone of her voice. Everything. Sondra raised her glass. "Cheers. Thanks for the drink. And the cover. I've been on my feet all night. I needed a break. It's nice to sit, if just for a bit. We heard that Billie Holiday might sit in, and things were slow down at the Deuces, so Joey let me sneak out. Have you ever heard Billie Holiday, Dr. Spencer?" Martin had heard every word, every syllable, but it hadn't registered. He was too intent on his own inner dialogue. "I know her," he thought, "but that's impossible. She reminds me of someone." It took him a minute to realize that she had asked him a question. I'm sorry, what? Have you heard Billie Holiday before, Dr. Spencer?" You don't need to call me that. You know, the doctor thing. and, I've only heard her on record. Have you heard her live? Yes, once up in Harlem. So, was it good, Sondra? Did you like it, Sondra? He enjoyed saying her name. She laughed. Are you kidding? She was great. Billie is the absolute best ever. Maybe it's Judy Garland? Is that who she reminds me of? He was still trying to figure it out. No, maybe it's the woman in the Thin Man movies. Who was that? Myrna Loy? Ida Lupino? She's so familiar. Sondra continued. She was excited. You know, Billie has a way of phrasing that's really swell. She kind of leans back against the band and makes you wait for the words. It's very compelling. She makes you wait, you know. What do they say? All good things come to those who wait. I think that's part of her strength. She's a strong singer, even though she doesn't sing loud. There's a courage in her singing, you know. It's irresistible, don't you think? He watched her face. It seemed to change with every word. She was so excited. Martin nodded and smiled, but was too distracted to let the conversation register fully. He struggled for a response. Are you a singer? He asked. I am, or I'm trying to be. Why do you ask? Your voice, it's very musical. She smiled. Ah, you're sweet to say that. Martin shrugged. No, just observant. The band had gathered on stage. Joe Jones, Basie's drummer, started a medium-tempo beat. Smiling broadly, he held the hi-hat cymbals with one hand and flamboyantly pounded out with the other. Ching, ching, ka-ching, ching, ka-ching. With his right foot, he began a quarter-note pulse that was felt more than heard, subtle yet powerful. Basie emerged to applause. He watched the drummer admiringly, then nodded to Freddie Green, the guitarist. They started. Freddie strummed quarter notes that locked in with Joe's bass drum. Martin began tapping his foot. The beat was infectious. Basie made a loud plink of a chord at the top of the keyboard with his right hand, smiled at the audience, and began to solo in the mid-range. 32 bars later, the horns jumped in with the three-note riff from Jumpin' at the Woodside. Martin sang along softly. Ba-doop-a-doom, boop, 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 ba-doop-a-doom, boop, boop, boop. He glanced at Sondra. She was singing too. They smiled at each other, their heads moving back and forth in unison. She gently touched his arm and nodded toward Shooter, who was lost in the music, eyes closed, head bobbing, a grin stretching from ear to ear. When Martin looked back, she was watching the band, her hand still on his arm. She caught his eye and mouthed, I love this. She gave his arm a squeeze, then let go, closed her eyes, and began to move to the music, swaying in her chair. It was sensual. He couldn't look away. He took a sip of scotch and looked around the room. Everywhere heads nodded in time, and what feet he could see were tapping in a spontaneous ballet from the ankles down. The music was alive with energy, and judging by the crowd's reaction, deeply appreciated. It puzzled Martin. He had read that by 1949 swing music was supposedly on its last legs. Magazines like Metronome and Downbeat ran headlines asking, Are the big bands dead? Swing had reached its peak in the mid to late 30s, fueled by large ensembles led by stars such as Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, Artie Shaw, Woody Herman, and Glenn Miller. The music was made for dancing, and although many of its successful leaders were white, they owed much to the innovations of African-American band leaders, most notably Fletcher Henderson, Duke Ellington, and Count Basie. Black bands toured widely and drew large crowds, but they were often paid less and frequently barred from staying in the hotels where they performed. The Basie Band in the late 40s had hit hard times for several reasons. America's entry into the war in 1941 ushered in an economic boom that should have been helpful, but the draft depleted the rosters of many bands, and the rationing of gas and rubber made touring difficult. The recording ban, which began in 1942 and lasted till 1944, was another blow. Once the war ended, it seemed like things might improve, but the war boom was followed by a war bust. The decline in popularity of big bands was due to the simple fact that supply exceeded demand. Too many bands and not enough people willing to pack the dance halls and hotel ballrooms like they had done a decade earlier. In 1 month, December 1946, Benny Goodman, Woody Herman, Harry James, Les Brown, and Tommy Dorsey all called it quits. Martin knew that before the end of the year, Basie would do the same. This stint on the street would seemingly be his last hurrah, but by the mid-50s, Basie would return with a new large ensemble and enjoy success performing and recording with singers like Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, and Joe Williams. Two separate streams of music would grow out of the embers of the big band era, the rise of the singing star and the emergence of rock and roll. A comparison of the Billboard charts in 1940 and 1950 is illustrative. In 1940, it was the bands of Tommy Dorsey, Artie Shaw, Glenn Miller, and Harry James that dominated the scene. By 1950, it was singers like Dinah Shore, Vaughn Monroe, Vic Damone, Frankie Lane, Kay Starr, and Perry Como who reigned. They were the new stars, and close behind were the rock and rollers like Bill Haley, whose Rock Around the Clock remained number 1 for 8 weeks and finished 1955 at number 2. Rock and roll drew heavily from the style called rhythm and blues, which in turn borrowed much from the Kansas City stomp blues. This was the same root from which the original Basie band had sprouted. Basie would tour until his death in 1984, and the band continues to perform under his name today. But the Count Basie Orchestra would never again achieve the popularity it had enjoyed in the 30s, when they recorded hits like 1 O'Clock Jump and Jumpin' at the Woodside. Martin thought of these things as the band played another one of its hits, Every Tub. He noticed Sondra looking around the room, no doubt hoping to see Billie Holiday. In the middle of the tune, she looked at her watch, frowned, and shouted at Shooter, "I got to get back, or Joy will kill me. I've already been gone too long. Come get me if she shows up, okay?" Shooter nodded without looking at her. He was absorbed in the music. Sondra stood and smiled at Martin. She said something he couldn't hear. The band was loud. He squinted and put a finger to his ear. I'm sorry, what?" Sondra bent close, her cheek brushing his as she picked up her coat. Once again her perfume drifted past, familiar, though he couldn't place it. "It was lovely talking with you, Martin. I really wanted to hear Billie, but I have to go back. If she shows, maybe Shooter can come and get me. Save me a spot, just in case." Martin nodded and watched her put on her coat. While still moving in time to the music, she made a quick toss of her head, flipped her hair free, tied the belt, smiled once more, and walked toward the exit. The coat hid the short skirt of her coat-check uniform, but still showed plenty of leg. She wore old-fashioned nylons with the seam up the back. "Betty Grable," he said to himself. "From the back she looks like Betty Grable. Maybe that's it." Shooter caught him staring. He tapped Martin on the arm and said rather loudly,
"She's a looker, ain't she? Great kid. Wants to be a singer."
Embarrassed, Martin turned back to the music. Chapter 20. Lady Day Sits In. The band played 3 more songs, then took a break. Basie stepped off the stage and headed to the front door. When he passed, he nodded, smiled, and said, "Hey, Martin." Shooter noticed.
So you know Count Basie?
Martin was surprised. He didn't know exactly what to say. He shrugged. Yeah, I guess I do. Shooter squinted.
So, you're a musician? You seem to know a lot about it.
I play the piano.
Who do you play with? What bands?
Nobody you'd know. Mainly the Topeka Jazz Workshop. The minute it came out of his mouth, Martin knew it would sound funny to Shooter. Shooter nodded.
Yeah, right. Never heard of that one. What is that, a territory band?
The term was generally used to indicate a band that was successful but didn't tour nationally. There were thousands of territory bands in the swing era. As a matter of fact, the Count Basie Orchestra had grown out of two of the best, the Blue Devils and the Benny Moten Orchestra. Both were historically important, but seldom ventured out of Kansas, Missouri, or Oklahoma. Yeah, I guess you'd call us a territory band, but I don't think we ever played anywhere but Topeka.
Topeka? That's the capital of Kansas, ain't it?
Yes, it is.
I know my capitals. They drilled that into us in 6th grade. You name any state, I can tell you the capital, all 48 of them. Never been west of the Hudson or north of Yonkers, but I know my states, my presidents too.
Shooter mentioning the number 48 caused Martin to catch himself. He had been lost in the music. He looked at the watch on his left wrist. It was 11. One more set, he said to himself. Shooter, you want another drink?
If you're buying, sure.
Shooter squinted again and asked.
So, Martin, tell me again what you're doing here, all the way from Kansas. Who's it you're looking for?
By this time, Martin was on his 5th or 6th scotch, and the alcohol had probably loosened his tongue a bit. Before he could stop himself, he blurted everything out in one long stream. Shooter, I'm 51 years old. I was born in 1950. I've come here from the future to find my father, who was a jazz musician and who will be murdered tomorrow at 11:50 on Broadway, just outside Birdland. I travel in time using photos which I carry in a styrofoam sleeve because they burn my hands. But when I stand in the place where they have been taken and put my fingers on the image, I'm transported to that very time and spot. During the course of Martin's explanation, Shooter's expression grew from a confused grimace to a wide-eyed, mouth-open look of amazement. When Martin had finished, no sound emanated from Shooter, but his shoulders started shaking in laughter. The sound came seconds later, a shriek of laughter, loud enough to draw stares from nearby tables. Martin smiled as Shooter laughed. His face was calm. In a way, a burden had been lifted. Shooter was still laughing when Martin rose and said, Let me go get that drink for you. When he reached the bar, he noticed a commotion at the front of the club. Billie Holiday had arrived. She and Basie were hugging. She wore a knee-length fur coat over a cream-colored silk gown. Her hair was pulled back and shiny. Tucked into it on the left side was a large gardenia, her trademark. Her lips were strikingly red, and the skin of her perfectly oval face glowed. She was accompanied by two men, both dressed in tuxedos. They followed behind her and Basie as they strolled leisurely to the back of the club, and then disappeared into what might have been a dressing room. Every eye in the room followed them. Martin ordered the drinks after a long wait at the bar. Shooter approached and said he was going to the Deuces to get his camera and tell Sondra that Billie had arrived. Martin nodded and turned so he could watch the table where he had left his coat. The coat with the styrofoam sleeve and the Fuji camera. I cannot lose those, he said to himself. He had ordered 2 drinks. When they arrived, he walked slowly, trying not to spill them. The club was now packed. The word had spread quickly. The band members moved to the stage. The audience grew silent in anticipation. then applauded when Basie appeared with the great singer on his arm. He led her to the microphone, then leaned into it and spoke in a dignified manner. He was the Count, after all. "Ladies and gentlemen, the one, the only, Miss Billie Holiday." With that, the music started. The brass began with strong and deliberate punches in the mid-register, followed by the saxes playing legato chords with an exaggerated vibrato. The ensemble, with a meticulous precision honed from years of playing together, ended their lines on a staccato upbeat. Silence followed, and Billie entered leisurely, delivering the first line of the song a cappella. She laid back on the time, making the audience wait, just as Sondra had described. Some might have thought she'd forgotten the words, but then Lady Day purred. "The way you wear your hat." Martin knew the song. It was "They Can't Take That Away From Me," a Gershwin hit from the show Shall We Dance? The song had been introduced in 1937 by Fred Astaire, who performed it on stage and in the movie as he danced around the room with Ginger Rogers. Since then, just about every singer who was anything has recorded it. Bing Crosby, Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, Mel Torme, Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett, Rod Stewart, and even Van Morrison. At the bridge of the tune, the middle part, the lyric claims, "We may never, never meet again on the bumpy road to love." Martin had never considered that the Gershwin song had sexual undertones, but now as the great singer teased each word in the line, "bumpy road to love," it bordered on the erotic. Miss Holiday let every syllable bounce in syncopation against the beat like an exotic dancer. With a dreamy look, her head back and her eyes closed, it was as if she was recalling something so amorous and sensual you might blush if she went into the details. There are very few videos of Billie Holiday, and Martin realized what a shame that was. To understand the greatness of Lady Day, you couldn't just listen, you had to watch her. The vocal was followed by an extraordinary saxophone solo. Martin would find out later it was the great Wardell Gray. Billie watched him and swayed gracefully back and forth to the music, raising her shoulders and eyebrows in unison whenever he played something particularly inventive. She was a great listener, not just a great performer. After the solo, the band played a shout section. It is called a shout section because it's usually the loudest part of the song. The horns, in full harmony but rhythmic agreement, most often will play a version of the melody with a bit more syncopation than the original statement. If the shout is well conceived by the arranger and well executed by the band, it can take the audience on a little musical trip and then drop them off at the reprise, a repeat of the original melody. Great arrangements are like great stories. They can take a listener on an amazing journey, and Basie had some of the greatest arrangements in the business. The tune concluded and the audience erupted in applause. With her two hands still on the microphone stand and with her head tipped to one side, she smiled with closed lips and made an imperceptible series of nods that traced the arc of the room from left to right. When she had taken full inventory of the appreciation of the crowd, she turned to the band in back of her and nodded to them. They were applauding as well. Martin was fascinated. If her intent was to display humility, he thought it hadn't worked. Her affect was the understated grace of royalty. She was the queen of every inch of musical space in the room, and it was clear that she knew it. As the audience was applauding, Martin reached into his coat pocket and removed the Fuji camera. He felt badly for Sondra, that she was missing Billie. From his place at the table, he stood and took a picture. Suddenly he realized what he must do next. Go somewhere private, extract the print, and wait for it to develop. "But where?" he said out loud. He looked to the men's room. There was a line 3 deep. He didn't know if the photo would develop properly, if the process was delayed. He grabbed his coat, put it on, and pushed himself through the crowd that had gathered just inside the door. Once outside, he realized that the street was just as busy as before. He fought his way through the crowd that was trying to get into the club. The word had spread. It was cold. The wind had kicked up, and he pulled the coat up around his neck. He had not taken time to button it. To his left was a bright haze of neon from the clubs. Too public, he said to himself. He turned to the right and began walking into the darker and less crowded part of 52nd Street. When he reached the first alley, he entered and leaned against a wall to brace himself. The print would be hot. It was dark, and he had a bit of trouble finding the tab. As he struggled to find it, two hands grabbed his arms from behind. He dropped the camera and twisted his head to see what was happening. The blow was hard and it came fast. He fell to the ground. Everything went dark.
You've been listening to Murder at Birdland, an audio novel. To learn more about the author and the story behind the music, visit murderatbirdland.com or mikesteinell.com.
She walked into the club wearing mink and satin. The world had traveled fast up and down Manhattan. She was just standing there with a gardenia in her hair, looking so fine. The joint was really packed. A line ran round the block. The Basie band was cooking. It was almost 1 o'clock. Basie just smiled so sweet, watching Lady Day swing at 2 feet. She was digging the gang. Then she leaned her head back and she sang, singing just like an angel. All the blues in the world was in her voice. You could hear all the joy and pain in every note. And you know she was swinging. she was swaying to the beat. He was flashing a grin, knowing that she'd be sitting in. She was singing the blues like she had nothing left to lose. Oh, the mood was right. Lady Day was in the house tonight.